Hello and welcome to another episode of History Stuff. So this is the latest in a series of mini biographies of historical figures from the 13th century. In the last few videos I've done men basically, people such as William Wallace, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, etc. And today I wanted to look at a very powerful, influential and almost completely neglected noblewoman from the period. And this is Margaret ap Gruffudd, or Margaret of Bromfield, as she is otherwise called. Margaret would be the Welsh form of her name. And who is she? Well, she was the sister of Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the Prince of Wales, who I made a video about previously. And she played a very important and influential role in this era of Welsh history, which, outside of a few academic studies and textbooks, has been almost completely forgotten. Margaret is a very obscure figure and almost, utterly neglected in the public sphere, if you like. Nobody, or very few people, ever talk about Margaret. And why would this be? Well, I think it's probably because she's quite an ambivalent figure, and it'd be quite difficult to portray her as some kind of heroine of Welsh history because her career is so ambivalent. And I'll show you what I mean, hopefully, in the course of this little discussion of her life. So who was she exactly? Well, Margaret was the full sister of Llywelyn. She was the daughter of Gruffudd ap Llywelyn, granddaughter of Llywelyn Fawr, Llywelyn the Great. Her mother was Sanana ferch Caradog, Llywelyn's mother. So Margaret was the full sister of Llywelyn and his three brothers, Owen Goch, Dafydd and Rhodri. We don't know much about her upbringing, although presumably it was the conventional upbringing of a Welsh royal princess. And she first comes to prominence in 1258, when Henry III, the King of England, he issued this very interesting order to the Earl of Gloucester, Richard de Clare. Henry ordered Richard de Clare to basically abduct Margaret, to seize her, take her prisoner, and prevent her doing damage to the king. What this means is that her brother Llywelyn was intending to marry off Margaret to one of his allies, and this ally specifically was Madog ap Gruffudd, a Prince of Powys. And what Henry wanted to avoid was any effective alliance between Llywelyn's family, the ruling house of Gwynedd, and one of the big, powerful ruling houses of Powys, because if they formed an alliance, that would threaten the English hegemony, the English power in Wales. And what Henry is trying to do, what all the kings of England have tried to do in Wales over the centuries, is to play a game of divide and rule. He wants to keep them separate, keep them at odds with each other, at each other's throats, so he can impose and maintain his overlordship of the Welsh princes. And any political dynastic alliance between the various houses threatens that. And Margaret, at this point, she must have been quite young, probably no more than 14 or 15 years old. She's a pawn in the great sort of political game of dynastic marriages. But it's quite interesting that the very first direct reference to her is as this important pawn. The king very much wants to get her into his custody so he can control her. We don't actually know if Richard de Clare carried out the order, and Margaret vanishes from the record for the next few years. We do know that the marriage went ahead sometime after 1258, and she did actually become the husband of Madog ap Gruffudd. Madog and his father, Gruffudd, are the rulers of northern Powys, Powys of Adog, and they were consistently loyal to Llywelyn, which is worth pointing out because Llywelyn can't trust many of his own followers. One of the problems he has within Wales is that he's trying to impose his power and control over the other Welsh rulers, and many of them don't like it. They don't want to be Llywelyn's vassals, they don't want to be his servants, they have their own ambitions, and he often struggles to get them to obey him. But the rulers of Powys of Adog are different. They are consistently loyal to Llywelyn throughout his career, and it's probably as a reward, as a recognition of their loyal service, that he marries his own sister to Madog. And as far as we know, Margaret and Madog have a happy marriage, or conventionally happy for the time. They have two sons, Gruffudd and Llywelyn, and Madog dies in about 1277. Um, and the context of his death is the first major war between the new King of England, Edward I, and Prince Llywelyn, which ends in complete disaster for Llywelyn. And one of the major defeats he suffers is that the royal army manages to advance into northern Powys, into Powys Madog, seize the chief stronghold of Castell Dinas Bran, this very dramatic castle perched on an outcrop. You can still see it today. It's very, very dramatic, romantic ruin, and forced a submission of the princes of Powys. And one of these, the most important one, was Margaret's husband, Madog, who dies shortly after this date, shortly after making this submission. Probably died in battle, perhaps. And Margaret is left a widow. And in the following years, her behaviour is very interesting, because she is not by any means a friend or a loyal supporter of her brother Llywelyn, the Prince of Wales. In fact, she causes him a lot of problems. Margaret's main ambition is to secure her lands and to secure the future of her children, her sons, Gruffudd and Llywelyn. And to that end, she must have been a very strong-willed, forthright personality, because she will fight anyone who threatens those things. She engages in all kinds of very bitter legal disputes against her neighbours, who are her brothers-in-law. They are the brothers of her late husband. And they try and claim bits of land from her, and try and take land away from her. But she resists them all very, in a very determined way. She takes them all to court and refuses to give up an inch of land. And by doing so, she antagonises her brother Llywelyn, who takes the side of her brothers-in-law, and he sends some very bitter complaints to the king, Edward I, protesting that his sister is being very difficult. She refuses to hand over legal documents when he demands them. She defies his authority at every turn, and basically makes life difficult for Llywelyn. And Margaret's relationship with the king, Edward, is interesting, because she seems to have some influence over him, and Edward in turn, at least for a few years, he definitely has some respect for Margaret, because he takes her advice. She is allowed to play an active role in the supervision of her lands and the upbringing of her sons, of her children. Edward sometimes seeks out her advice, which is quite unusual for a king to seek out the advice of a noblewoman. And in general, Edward seems to favour Margaret over Llywelyn. Whether he does this simply because he sees Margaret as a useful tool to use against the Prince of Wales, we don't know, but there is an implication that he does actually hold her in some regard as an individual. So again, this implies that Margaret was must have been quite a forthright and impressive personality. Unfortunately, this all comes crashing down in 1282 when Edward and Llywelyn go to war again. Unfortunately for Margaret, her relationship with the king completely breaks down at this point. We're not sure why, whether it's simply because Edward now no longer had any sympathy for the Welsh at all, particularly the Welsh royal family and Llywelyn's family, or whether Margaret had committed some specific offence. But the king at one point explicitly says in one of his orders that he wants to hear no more from Margaret, that she had offended him, and that basically he was cutting all ties with her. And that's bad enough, but then something even more sinister happens, which gives rise to a very dark folk tale. Both of her sons, Gruffudd and Llywelyn, who were still quite young at this point, although we don't know their exact age, both of them vanish. And there is a later folk tale that they were both drowned under Holt Bridge in mid-Wales, and that they were drowned by two of Edward's captains, two of his nobles, Earl Warren and Roger Mortimer. The tale is probably fictitious because, for one thing, the bridge that the children were supposed to have been drowned under, it wasn't even there at the time. It was only built centuries later. And there's really nothing in the contemporary record to suggest that they were murdered. They simply vanish. And it could be that they were killed in battle. We don't know. But the point is they do disappear, and Margaret is left in a very difficult position, very sad. She's now a widow, she's lost her children, she's lost her land, she no longer has the king's favour, and the rest of her family suffered very heavily. I mean, Llywelyn and his brother Dafydd are killed by the royal army. Dafydd is executed at Shrewsbury. Their children are locked up either in prison at Bristol or in religious communities in Lincolnshire. The last brother, Rodri, is left alone. He's allowed to live in England and be a sort of harmless English landowner. But in general, the family has suffered very heavily, catastrophic losses. And Margaret is left childless and destitute. And you have to wonder at this point how she's living. Where's she living? What's she living off? There is at least a reasonably happy end to the tale. Edward, for whatever reason, why he was angry with Margaret specifically, we don't know, but he does get over it. His sort of anger cools, and 2 years later, in 1284, he grants Margaret some money out of charity, 5 marks to be paid to her every year. As well as the rents of 2 towns, which altogether amounts to about £5 to £10 a year, which is enough for her to live on in some comfort. I mean, it's a very far cry from when she was a Princess of Wales, married to one of the most important princes of Wales in Powys, and living basically as a queen. But at least she would have had enough to live on in relative comfort, and she didn't die destitute. And the last reference to her is in 1299, when it's recorded that the towns she had been granted had been re-granted to one of Edward's loyal supporters, Morgan ap Meredith, because Margaret, sister of Prince Llywelyn, had recently died. So we know her date of death, 1299. And that's the tale of Margaret. As I said, quite an ambivalent figure. There's a lot of detail in there that I didn't have time. I never have time to pack into these videos, but I just wanted to give a general overview of her career, because she's a very interesting member of this very interesting royal family in Wales. And I suspect she's been largely forgotten because she's not a straightforward figure. You wouldn't be able to make a straightforward patriotic hero out of her from the Welsh point of view, in the way that someone like Princess Llywelyn, who was killed by the Normans at the Battle of Kidwelly in 1136, you couldn't cast her in that light. Llywelyn is a sort of warrior queen who met her end fighting the wicked foreigners, and that makes for a great copy. You know, that's a very memorable character, somebody you can stick on a poster or even make a film out of. But you couldn't do the same for Margaret, because for much of her life she was actually opposed to her brother Llywelyn, which effectively meant she was opposed to what you might call the Welsh cause, the cause of Welsh independence, which doesn't make her a traitor though. It just means that she was doing what pretty much everyone else was doing, which is to try and look after their own interests and the interests of their family. Unfortunately for Margaret, that all went horribly wrong, and she didn't achieve any of those things. She was unable in the end to protect her children, even though we don't know exactly what happened to them, but it was probably not. I mean, being realistic about it, they probably met a violent end somehow. And she was left, I imagine, a very lonely and vulnerable figure. As I said, at the end at least, she did receive some charity from the king, Edward I, who didn't just let her live destitute. But it still makes for quite a sad, bleak tale, but a very interesting one, and another one from this era of Welsh history, which I find fascinating, and hopefully you do as well. Okay, I hope you found that interesting. Please feel free to leave any comments below if you have any, and hopefully I'll speak to you again. Bye-bye.